Welcome into the second section of bonus content for the Producing on a Budget course. In this section of bonus content, we're going to be talking about maximizing loudness, which is just another way of saying final peak limiting. Typically, it's associated with a dedicated mastering stage, but it doesn't necessarily have to be. And so we'll be talking about that a little bit. I encourage you to go back to the course, or if you haven't watched the videos already, to go and watch the videos where we talk about the various forms of dynamic processing, talk about master bus processing, because really here we're going to be getting into some of the nitty-gritty details. And this video is really the conceptual video. So why are we doing this? What benefits does it have? Is it even worth attempting? That's kind of the point of this. And then the following few videos will be using different types of freeware and hearing the various results that we can get. They all try to do the same thing, but they sound very different. And one of the main goals of this course is understanding that every single processor has a unique character, and that with freeware, you can get a really wide array of results if you just test it and try it out. Here in this picture, we're seeing a woman who either is listening to a really great song or has just had her ears blown out by something that was unexpected. It's a great ambiguous picture, and I think we've all been on both sides of that coin in the past. When it comes to mastering your own music, and specifically that process of maximization at the end, 9 times out of 10, the advice that you get is don't do it. You don't have the ears for it. You don't have the equipment. You don't have the experience. You don't know what you're doing. So you should hire somebody else to do it. And with education in general and how we approach it, especially with music production, I think there are way too many don'ts. And if you trust every single don't that you read on the internet and you never do try it, you're missing out on an opportunity to gain a lot of valuable experience. And I know that this advice is coming out because people are trying to save you from potentially doing something that could quote unquote ruin your music. Well, if you're an amateur and you're not planning for your song to sell millions of copies, does it make more sense to try to master it yourself and gain a decent amount of experience and knowledge into what that process entails? Or should you hire somebody, pay a lot of money, and only for your track not to sell at all? For me, it makes a lot more sense to go with the first option, because when you do evolve to a point where you can hire a mastering engineer and it makes sense to do so, you'll be able to have a very mature and intelligent conversation with them about what you want. And that's something that I think a lot of mastering engineers do like. The ones who are really good will like that, will like the feedback that you're giving back to them because they know that you understand a little bit about their craft. And that really does go a long way. So of course, I'd love to hire the best mastering engineer for all of my work, but I don't have the budget to do that. Number one, I'd also love to hire professional musicians to come in to record any part that I wanted, but it's not really realistic to do that. And if you're a beginner or even up to an intermediate level music producer, mix engineer, you just can't afford it, and that's fine. And I think it's better to do it yourself than to risk one of those cloud-based services where they're just running all of your music through the same presets, and then it ruins that personal experience. I don't have a problem with a professional mastering engineer using a preset as long as they're still dedicating a lot of time and really kind of from a personal level trying to accomplish something for the track, trying to get the most out of the track. And a lot of those factory-based, cloud-based mastering services, they could care less about your music. They're just doing it quick, sending it back to you, charging you a small amount of money, and then moving on to the next one. Well, I could do the same thing, and at least I feel like I care about what the result is going to be. So in my opinion, if you want to get really good at something, the best thing to do is to try it. And I'm not saying that you want to necessarily get really good at mastering, but you want to become a good music producer. You want to feel like you know what's going on, that you understand all of the processes involved in making a song. And it's important to learn things the hard way, right? Don't just trust somebody telling you not to do something. You need to trust yourself the most and gain those valuable experiences that in the future really do take you a long way, which is why I think when people give the advice of don't do your own mastering, they mean it with the best of intentions. And that's the advice that I'd give a professional who's a music producer, but they already know that. But as a beginner, you want to gain that experience because in the early stages of making music, That's what it's all about. And that's really what it's going to help you a lot in the future, help you grow, help you evolve, and also develop your ear in a lot of way. Because the first few times that maybe you try to master something yourself, you're not sure what you're doing. You're just hearing it louder and you're liking the fact that it's louder. But eventually your ear starts to tune in. You go, oh, well, just because it's louder, it also means that maybe the balances have been thrown off. So I need to think about that a little bit more. And as we go through this presentation, you'll understand why that can be so valuable if and when you do reach a stage where you're able to hire somebody to potentially do that mastering for you. All of this information is coming in a bonus section for a reason. Maximizing loudness, it's just one small minor step in the grand scheme of your production. If you spend so much time dedicated to this or think that by maximizing loudness at the end that you're going to be able to cover up any kind of mistakes or problems earlier on, you're not going to be able to do that. I really believe that whether a song is mastered way too loud or way too quietly, that a good track is a good track. And the mastering stage isn't going to save that. It's not going to change that. And cream always rises to the top. The best stuff is going to get popular regardless, or people are going to appreciate the best stuff even if a mistake has been made here or there. I mean, that's why it's like music is so subjective. It's such a feel-based thing that something as small as maximizing the loudness, one way or the other, it's probably not going to ruin the track. It's possible, but very unlikely. And also, I would say that these ideas, these topics, they're not going to radically change your life or your music. It might help you out a little bit, might help you with your ear training, gaining some of that valuable experience that we talk about so much. But at the end of the day, it's just one small step, just one process in the grand scheme of making music. The first question that we encounter in this presentation is why do it? Why actually go through the process of applying that peak limiter when you could just have a mastering engineer do it? Well, I would say from the get-go, most, if not all of your reference songs that you're using, if you are using them to compare your production to something that you enjoy, you're listening to a final version, something that has been maximized, something that has been mastered. And with that in mind, it's very difficult to now judge the balances on your unmastered track to the balances of the mastered track. It's a very difficult thing and something that I think is oftentimes overlooked. If you were able to get that raw mix file before mastering, this wouldn't be important. This wouldn't be a problem. You wouldn't really need to worry so much about adding that peak limiter, but that's just not the reality of the files that you have access to. So by actually going in and doing this final stage, even if you take it off and send it to a mastering engineer at the end, by maximizing your songs, you'll get a better feel for how your mix is comparing to that fully mastered, fully maximized track. And in the process, you'll gain valuable experience for the next mix. So you'll be able to think about how the balances are going to change when you apply that final stage. So maybe you don't make some of the mistakes that you made before, because let's say in your mixing process, you get something very close to that final mastered result, specifically with your frequency balances. Well, think back to those equal loudness curves. When you bring the overall level up, things are going to change. And now suddenly you have to go back and make adjustments, or you send it to a mastering engineer and they send it back to you for adjustments. And you want to try to be as efficient and smart as you possibly can be. I mean, that's one of the goals, or that's one of the traits of a really good music producer, is being very efficient, being very smart. And so by anticipating what will happen when you get to that final gain stage, it can make a world of difference and can really help you out. And again, it's all about gaining that experience. Why do it too? That was more of the conceptual, philosophical growth as a student, but there also are very practical reasons. And the one that you've probably heard in the past and will hear again in the future is to be competitive. There are a lot of negative connotations to that, but I do think that that's the best way to put it. And it's just a very true statement. You can't put out music that's a lot quieter than everything else and expect that a label is going to accept it. It's unfortunate, but the people who are oftentimes judging what music, what artist to sign, they may not be the most discerning listeners. And so if they have 100 tracks on their desk and they're listening through to them and they pick out some that don't feel like they've gone through that rough mastering stage, and if their mind that's a requirement, they'll just throw your track out. They won't even listen to more than 10 seconds of it. Is it unfair? Absolutely, but that's kind of the cruelness and the reality of the situation. So sometimes you need to be competitive if you're going to try to make that next step in your career or your production journey, whatever. And just from even more of a basic standpoint here, not like you're trying to get signed to a label, if there's a playlist of music, or if you have the autoplay on YouTube and you're listening to a particular genre of music and your track happens to be the one that comes up next and it hasn't been mastered, or it hasn't been maximized, I should say, to a relatively close level to everything else, the listener is going to have to go into that tab and they're going to have to change the volume. They're going to have to turn it up or they're going to have to turn it down. And you could argue that if your song is a lot different, whether that's a lot louder or a lot softer, it will get the listener's attention. And that can't possibly be a bad thing because they'll come over to that tab, they'll see your name. But I think you want to be careful with this only because you don't want to be that guy who's intentionally going out of their way to get noticed. And I know that there are certain points in people's career or certain points in having tried for a long time and not having any success where that will be a temptation. And I'm not going to tell you not to do it because I think that would be unfair. But you need to be careful of getting a bad reputation. But of course, when you've exhausted every other avenue, why not try it, right? And I think with a lot of small labels, and this is more true in the pop music world, you'll find that some of the newer labels, some of the smaller ones, will attempt to pull some of these gimmicks because they feel like they need to get that attention. I know a lot of studies have kind of been done, and a lot of them have come back to show that, RMS level, the quote unquote perceptive louder levels doesn't really impact sales. So the trend is actually down. And you have to remember that iTunes and some of these other music stores, they have particular standards. And so they will reject things, or they'll just take your audio and do some kind of really aggressive form of processing, which you want to try to avoid. But what you want to do is you do kind of want to be competitive just for a lot of practical reasons. It makes sense to do so, to get yourself into that ballpark so that it fits in. And I know that conforming isn't always what you want to go for, but in this case, especially with popular music, and when I say popular music, I mean music that you hope to sell or that you hope blends in with a genre, being competitive is something that you probably want to think about and, kind of strive for. It's not a requirement, but I think there are good reasons to do it. The next question that we come across is when to do it. When do you want to apply that peak limiting? At what stage in the music making process are you doing this? And this really does just depend on your own preference. And I think it depends on how you've been brought up doing it. So if you're brand new, you're kind of lucky because you get to choose where you do this. If you're like me, I actually have probably always been brought up doing it with the last bullet in mind of making the music, doing the full mix, and then kind of slapping it on at the end and assuming it doesn't make things sound a lot worse. I'm normally happy with it. Now, is that the best way to go about it? For me, it seems to work okay. For other people, it works really well because they're anticipating what is going to happen when they bring on that final maximizer or peak limiter. But I think if you're more of a beginner, the second bullet might make more sense so that you're never chasing your tail and having to go back and make alterations. So the second bullet states that it's not a bad idea to consider adding the maximizer after you set your rough mix balances. So before you go in and start doing additional EQ or additional compression, at that time you go to the master bus, you throw on that peak limiter. And the reason being, you can now mix into that loudness, mixing into what's on the master bus. And then you make your mix decisions based on the final level in mind. And so when you add the peak limiter, you might actually find that there's less that you have to do now because it's brought things together in a way that you didn't expect. And I've kind of started to tinker and experiment with this, and I found that it makes the direction of my mix so much easier because I'm now not worried about what's going to happen when I need to bring on the mastering because it's already there. With everything, there's always pros and there's cons to it. A con is that your ears are going to fatigue a bit more because you're working with something that's a lot louder. So hopefully if you get those rough mix balances really good, you've already done a lot of effects processing in the production, there may not be too much to do. But at the same time, it can be dangerous, and it does require that you take more breaks and all of that. But I just thought I'd let you know that there are multiple ways to approach this. And then oftentimes, after you finish everything, you'll be able to turn off what you've put on the master bus. And if you are sending it then to a dedicated mastering engineer, or if you want to go in and even maybe then have another crack at it, you know that you're already going to be in the ballpark. And a mastering engineer, or most mastering engineers, the ones with a lot of experience who understand that it's not about them doing a lot, it's just about them getting the sound, they'll be thankful that you've really kind of put it right there in their lap for them. And then they can maybe try a few different things, use different processors. But ultimately, if you say, hey, this was my mastering chain, and they try it out and they agree, this does sound the best, I mean, that's the perfect scenario. You have a new set of ears telling you that what you've done is correct. And nothing is more gratifying than when you're able to tell a mastering engineer, hey, I've done this. And they go, you know what? That actually works really well. A lot of them won't tell you that because they're very prideful. But the best ones are willing to check themselves at the door and really just give you that mastering engineer set of ears to then, finalize it and agree and whatnot. And even just having a friend or a buddy listen to what you've done with that chain, and if they really dig it and like it, that goes a long way. So just a couple different approaches that you can have. Both will work just as well. The one just gives you a few more advantages in knowing that you're not going to be chasing your tail if you apply stuff after the fact. What to listen for. For the beginner to intermediate level producer, this is the most difficult part. It was very difficult for me for a number of years. It really took me to fully understand dynamics processing before I even had any idea of what I was trying to listen for when it got to the peak limiting stage. And again, this is why this is falling in the bonus content section. The gain change, that's what's going to be the most obvious part. It's kind of the most exciting part too. So I'm not going to lie and say that when I turn the peak limiter on and off, I don't get a little bit of a thrill knowing that it's gone a lot louder. But at the same time, you then realize, oh, well, when I listen to everything else, it's gone through that. So it's really not that exciting. And that's sort of, it's gotten a lot louder. It's gotten more exciting. The novelty wears off on that pretty quick. And you realize that that's not necessarily what you want to be focusing on, at least not mainly, unless things still seem way too quiet or they seem way too loud based on a reference. So what you're really listening to are the balances, okay? Usually specifically frequency, but now also it could come back to dynamics. So for example, you might hear that the kick, which you felt you had mixed perfectly, is now way too prominent or it's getting buried. Does the track itself become way too bright or way too dark in general? And there are many more questions that you'll ask and many more feelings and sensations that you'll have. But this is the point. This is what you're actually listening for. Think back to the equal loudness curves. When you bring up level, things do start to change because we do not hear in a linear fashion. Things change based on if they're louder or softer. And if you're aware of that, you'll know that it might require you, after adding the final bit of gain, to go back and make some changes. At this stage, and to learn, I think, the most effectively, having a reference can become very useful because you can now compare the balances that you achieved versus the balances that they achieved and ask yourself whether or not you prefer what you were able to come up with. And depending on when and how you've applied the peak limiter, the final maximizer, you'll be able to go back and make changes to the mix. And again, this is what you want to do. This is part of the process. And even if you know you're going to a mastering engineer, you still want to get things sounding really good so that you can turn off those final things and send it off to them knowing that you feel very confident and comfortable about what will happen when they add on the additional loudness at the end. Now we come to the tools. And the following few videos are going to be about the tools. That's really going to do it for the conceptual stuff. And that's the stuff to kind of sit back and really think about. But there are a lot of different sonic maximizers on the market, some really good free ones. For a long time, you had to go commercial. You had to pay. Otherwise, the sound would kind of break up if you were going for competitive levels with what you were hearing, in top 40 or whatever. And I think that each sonic maximizer is capable of different levels of extreme or extremes of how loud you can actually go. But nowadays, that's not becoming as important because, again, I think that overall the trend is going down in terms of what RMS level people are shooting for and the like. So what you're really now listening for is the character of these tools, usually specifically how is it handling the transients? Is it adding in saturation? Is it not? How is the release working? Is there a variable release? Those are the sort of questions that you're going to ask, and it goes beyond just sheer loudness. Does the style of peak limiting sound good for my song? Would a different processor perhaps fit and work better? And a lot of these are subjective taste questions, because one person may argue, I really like the punch of this one, whereas another person will argue, I like the transparency. So some of this has to do with genre, but most importantly, it has to do with your own ear. So what we're going to do is look at a few different examples and listen to the sounds that they're able to produce. So thank you for your attention. And in the next few videos, we will be looking at some additional freeware, some that we've explored already, and some new tools to add if you want to take a crack at doing your own final sonic maximization. Thank you.